The scream tore through the mansion like a blade cutting silk. Not a human scream, something deeper, primal, carrying the weight of 400 pounds of muscle and fong. Margaret stood frozen in the hallway, her hand still gripping the doorknob, watching as the massive lioness rose from the Persian rug with eyes that reflected something between curiosity and hunger. This was her first morning as nanny in the Whitmore estate. Nobody had mentioned the lions. But that's not what this story is really about. What you're about to hear goes far beyond the eccentricity of a millionaire who kept apex predators as house pets. This is about the moment when everything everyone thought they understood about the boundary between human and wild shattered like glass. About what happened when someone dared to see past the fear, past the rules, past the warnings whispered by every employee who'd walked these marble floors before her. Because Margaret did something in that house that nobody, not the trainers, not the specialized staff, not even Richard Whitmore himself with all his money and arrogance, had ever dared to attempt. And what followed changed not just her life, but revealed a truth about the relationship between humans and predators that most people will never accept. Right now, you're standing at the edge of a story that will make you question everything you think you know about control, trust, and the invisible threads that connect all living beings. You'll witness moments of breathtaking beauty and heart-stopping terror. You'll see how a woman with nothing but intuition walked into a world where one wrong move meant death, and somehow found a language that transcended species. But here's what haunts me about this story: the ending. The part that nobody saw coming. The revelation that turns everything, the danger, the bond, the trust, into something far more complex and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Think about this. What do we really understand about the creatures we share this planet with? How much of what we call wild is simply a mirror reflecting our own fear? And what happens when someone refuses to look away from that mirror? These questions don't have easy answers. But if you're here, it means you're the kind of person who doesn't settle for the surface. Someone who understands that the most profound truths are often hidden in the places others are too afraid to look. So here's what I need from you. Leave a like on this video right now. Not just to support the channel, but because stories like this, stories that reveal the hidden side of our connection to the natural world, deserve to reach people who are brave enough to hear them. And in the comments, write, "I'm ready to uncover the hidden truth." By doing that, you're not just engaging with a video. You're joining a community of people who refuse to accept the sanitized versions of reality we're fed every day. People who want to understand the raw, unfiltered truth about what happens when humans and nature collide in ways that defy explanation. Congratulations! You're already part of something most people will never have the courage to seek. Now, prepare yourself. What comes next contains a revelation that will forever change how you see the relationship between humans and wild animals. The kind of truth that, once you know it, you can never unknow. The kind that makes you realize just how little separates the civilized from the savage, the tame from the wild, the safe from the deadly. Margaret's story begins on a cold November morning in 2019, in a mansion that held secrets far darker than anyone could have guessed. Margaret Chen had seen the job posting 3 times before she finally applied. Each time, something about it made her scroll past. The salary was too high, almost absurdly so for a nanny position. $25,000 a month. No family paid that much unless there was something they weren't telling you. But desperation has a way of quieting instinct. After her mother's cancer diagnosis, after the medical bills that swallowed her savings like a black hole, after her previous employer let her go because they needed someone with more availability, which really meant someone without a dying parent, Margaret found herself staring at that posting again. This time, she clicked. The interview had been strange from the beginning. Not at the Whitmore estate itself, but in a sterile office building downtown, conducted by a lawyer named Harrison who spoke in careful, measured tones. He'd asked the usual questions: her experience with children, her certifications, her availability, but then came the unusual ones. How do you respond to unexpected situations, Miss Chen? Are you comfortable with unconventional household environments? Have you ever worked with animals? That last question should have been a warning. But Margaret, thinking perhaps they had a dog or a few cats, had smiled and nodded. She'd grown up with pets. She loved animals. Harrison had paused then, his pen hovering over his notepad. Miss Chen, before we proceed, I need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. What you see and experience in the Whitmore household cannot be discussed with anyone outside the estate. The compensation reflects this requirement. She'd signed. What choice did she have? The mansion sat 40 minutes outside the city, hidden behind 12-foot walls and an iron gate that opened with a kind of smooth, expensive silence that whispered of serious money. As Margaret's modest Honda followed the black Mercedes that Harrison drove, she watched the manicured grounds unfold like a dream, or perhaps a mirage. Fountains, perfectly trimmed hedges, gardens that probably required a full-time staff of their own. The house itself was obscene in its grandeur. Not a home, but a monument to wealth, all glass and white stone, modern angles that seemed to challenge gravity itself. Through the windows, she could see cathedral ceilings, chandeliers that probably cost more than her mother's entire medical debt. Harrison parked in the circular driveway and gestured for her to follow. Mr. Whitmore is traveling on business. You'll meet him in a few days. For now, I'll introduce you to Sophia and explain your duties. Sophia is the daughter? Margaret asked, hurrying to keep pace with Harrison's long strides. Yes. She's 7 years old. Bright child, but she's had some difficulties with previous caregivers. What kind of difficulties? Harrison's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. The estate can be overwhelming for some people. The isolation. The unique aspects of Mr. Whitmore's lifestyle. They entered through a side door, into a mudroom that was larger than Margaret's entire apartment. Beyond it, a hallway stretched into the heart of the house, its walls lined with photographs. Richard Whitmore shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons at building openings, standing beside exotic cars and yachts. In every image, his smile was perfect, practiced, revealing nothing. Mr. Whitmore made his fortune in pharmaceutical development, Harrison explained as they walked. He's a private man. Values his solitude. This estate allows him to live as he chooses, away from prying eyes and judgment. That phrase, as he chooses, carried weight Margaret couldn't quite interpret. They climbed a sweeping staircase to the second floor, and that's when Margaret heard it for the first time. A sound that made her heart stutter. Deep, rumbling, resonant. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something that vibrated through the floor itself. She stopped mid-step. What was that? Harrison didn't turn around. That's part of what makes this position unique, Miss Chen. Mr. Whitmore has exotic pets. You'll become accustomed to them. Exotic pets. Her voice had climbed an octave. What kind of exotic pets? He finally looked back at her, and in that moment, Margaret saw something she hadn't noticed during the interview. A kind of weary resignation, as if he'd had this conversation too many times before. Lions, Miss Chen. Mr. Whitmore keeps lions. The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's mind struggled to process them, to fit them into any reasonable framework of reality. Lions. As in, actual lions. 3 of them. 2 females and 1 male. They have enclosures on the property, but Mr. Whitmore prefers to keep them close. They have access to certain areas of the house during supervised times. Margaret's hand found the banister, gripping it for support. And you're telling me this now? After I signed the NDA? After I drove all the way here? Would you have come if I'd told you during the interview? The honest answer was no. The answer she needed to give, thinking about her mother's treatment, the pile of bills, the eviction notice she'd received last week, was different. How close do they get to Sophia? That's actually where you come in. Harrison resumed climbing the stairs, and Margaret, after a moment of paralysis, followed. The previous nannies, they couldn't handle the situation. They were afraid. The lions sensed it. Fear creates problems, Miss Chen. It makes animals unpredictable. Sophia needs someone who can maintain calm, who won't transmit anxiety. And if I can't? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrison paused at the top of the stairs, his hand on an ornate door handle. Then you'll be like the others. You'll leave. But I don't think you're like the others, Miss Chen. I read people for a living, and I see something in you. A strength born from necessity. Am I wrong? She wanted to say yes, he was wrong, that she was terrified, that this was insane. But the truth was more complicated. Margaret had spent the last 2 years watching her mother fight a battle against her own body, had held her hand through chemotherapy sessions that left her retching and hollow-eyed, had learned that sometimes courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision that something else matters more. "Show me," she said. Harrison opened the door. The room beyond was nothing like Margaret expected. Not a cage, not an enclosure, a living space that looked transplanted from some luxury safari lodge. Warm amber lighting, rich fabrics, furniture built low to the ground. And on a massive cushion near the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathed in morning sunlight, lay the lioness. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Her coat gleamed golden bronze, muscles rippling beneath skin with every breath. Her head was the size of a basketball, her paws bigger than Margaret's hands spread wide. When she opened her eyes, those amber eyes that seemed to glow with their own light, and fixed them on Margaret, time itself seemed to stop. "This is Zahara," Harrison said, his voice lower now, respectful. "She's 11 years old. Mr. Whitmore raised her from a cub after her mother was killed by poachers in South Africa. She's the most docile of the three." Docile. The word seemed absurd applied to a creature that could end a human life with one swipe of those massive paws. As if reading Margaret's thoughts, Harrison continued, "The other two, Cassie, the other female, and Tao, the male, are kept in separate areas most of the time. They're younger, more aggressive. Zahara is the one who has the most freedom in the house. She's bonded with Mr. Whitmore since she was 6 weeks old." Margaret couldn't stop staring. The lioness hadn't moved, but her gaze remained fixed, unblinking, assessing. Margaret felt like she was being measured, weighed, judged by a consciousness that operated on frequencies humans had long forgotten. Will she? Margaret couldn't form the question. She won't attack unless threatened, or unless she interprets your behavior as prey behavior. That's crucial to understand. No sudden movements. No running. No high-pitched sounds or panic. Lions are predators, Miss Chen. They've evolved to detect and respond to prey signals. As long as you don't trigger those instincts, Zahara will view you as another member of the household. A small voice came from behind them, startling Margaret so badly she nearly stumbled. "She likes it when you're not scared." Margaret turned to see a small girl in the doorway, Sophia Whitmore, with her father's sharp features softened by childhood, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore expensive clothes that looked barely worn, and her eyes held a strange mixture of intelligence and loneliness that Margaret recognized instantly. She'd seen that look in the mirror often enough. "Sophia," Harrison said, his formal tone warming slightly. "This is Margaret Chen. She'll be taking care of you." Sophia studied Margaret with the same intense focus as the lioness, and Margaret had the unsettling sensation of being examined by two predators simultaneously, albeit very different kinds. "The last one cried," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "Ms. Patricia. She cried when Zahara came close, and Zahara didn't like it. She roared, and Ms. Patricia ran away and never came back." "That must have been scary for you," Margaret said, finding her voice. Sophia shrugged, but Margaret caught the flash of something in her eyes, hurt, perhaps, or resignation. How many caregivers had this child watched flee? "I'm used to it. People always leave. Zahara stays." The loneliness in those words cut deeper than any fear Margaret felt. She looked at this little girl, who'd learned to trust lions more than humans, who spoke about abandonment with the casual acceptance of someone who expected nothing else, and something shifted inside Margaret. She'd been thinking about this job as survival, as money to save her mother, as a temporary horror to endure. But looking at Sophia, she saw something else, a child who needed someone to stay. Someone who wouldn't run. Margaret took a slow breath and stepped further into the room. Harrison moved as if to stop her, but Margaret held up her hand. "It's okay," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. Zahara's ears twitched forward, her attention sharpening. Margaret could feel her heart hammering, could hear the blood rushing in her ears, but she kept her breathing steady, her movements fluid. She'd read somewhere that predators could smell fear, that it came through in the chemical composition of sweat, in the frequency of your heartbeat. Whether that was true or not, she focused on projecting calm. She didn't approach the lioness directly. Instead, Margaret moved to the side, sitting down slowly on one of the low couches, positioning herself at the same level as Zahara rather than looming above. She kept her gaze soft, not challenging, not submissive, just present. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Zahara rose with liquid grace, and Margaret's entire body tensed despite her efforts at control. The lioness was even more massive standing, her shoulder height reaching Margaret's chest. Each step she took seemed to shake the floor. She padded closer, and Margaret could smell her, musky, wild, carrying hints of raw meat and something else, something ancient and indefinable. Zahara stopped an arm's length away, her nostrils flaring as she scented Margaret, her amber eyes inches from Margaret's face. Margaret held perfectly still. This close, she could see every detail: the pattern of Zahara's whiskers, the way her pupils dilated and contracted, the slight scarring along her muzzle that spoke of a life lived before this mansion. She could feel the heat radiating from the lioness's body, could hear the deep, rhythmic breathing that sounded like distant thunder. Then Zahara did something unexpected. She sat down, massive haunches settling onto the floor, and continued to stare at Margaret with an expression that seemed almost curious. "She's deciding about you," Sophia said softly from the doorway. "She did this with me too, when I was little. Daddy says she's trying to understand if you're pack." Pack. The word resonated with something primal in Margaret's chest. She thought about her own small pack, her mother, fighting for her life in a sterile hospital room. The lengths Margaret would go to protect her. The fierce, irrational love that made her take this impossible job. Perhaps Zahara sensed something of that. Perhaps there was recognition in those ancient eyes, an understanding that transcended species. Or perhaps Margaret was projecting human emotions onto a predator who was simply deciding whether she was food or not. Either way, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute, Zahara made a sound, a low chuffing noise, and turned away, padding back to her cushion by the window. She settled down with a heavy sigh, as if the entire examination had been tedious, and closed her eyes. Harrison released a breath Margaret hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well," he said, a note of surprise in his carefully controlled voice. "That went better than expected." Margaret's hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding through her system in delayed response to what had just happened. But she kept them hidden, clasped in her lap, and forced a smile for Sophia. "I think we're going to get along just fine." Sophia's returning smile was tentative but genuine, and in that moment, Margaret knew she'd passed more than just a test with a lion. She'd passed a test with a lonely child who'd learned to expect disappointment. She had no idea then, sitting in that strange room with a lioness and a broken child, that this was only the beginning. That what she'd just experienced was the gentlest introduction to a world that would soon reveal itself to be far stranger, far more dangerous, and far more heartbreaking than anything she could have imagined. The first week passed in a surreal haze, as if Margaret had stepped through a mirror into a world that operated by different rules. She quickly learned the rhythms of the Whitmore estate, when the lions were allowed inside, mornings and evenings, when they were confined to the outdoor enclosures, during the heat of the day, when it was safe to move freely through the house and when you needed to check every room before entering. Harrison had provided her with a thick binder of protocols. Emergency numbers. Procedures if a lion behaved aggressively. Schedules for feeding times that involved whole animal carcasses delivered weekly by a specialized supplier, a detail that made Margaret's stomach turn the first time she witnessed it. Zahara, Kasi and Tao were fed in their outdoor enclosure, away from Sophia's eyes, though the child seemed unbothered by the reality of her father's pet's dietary needs. "They're predators," Sophia had explained with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child raised in unusual circumstances. Daddy says we can't change their nature. We can only respect it. It was a philosophy that seemed to govern Richard Whitmore's entire approach to the lions. Margaret was learning. And yet there was something unsettling about it, something she couldn't quite articulate. A mansion full of wild animals treated as house pets, a child growing up surrounded by creatures that could kill her in seconds. What kind of man created this environment? And why? She tried asking Sophia about her father, but the girl's answers were strangely hollow. He's very busy. He travels a lot. He loves the lions. He says they're purer than people. Purer than people. The phrase stuck with Margaret like a burr. She'd also learned that Sophia's mother was dead, had died when Sophia was 3, in what the girl referred to only as the accident. No other caregivers seemed to work at the estate full-time. There were housekeepers who came twice a week, always in pairs, never staying past 5 p.m. A groundskeeper who maintained the exterior but never entered the house. The trainer who worked with the lions, a taciturn man named Victor who spoke more to the animals than to humans. It was an isolated world, and Sophia was at its center, orbiting between her father's occasional presence and the constant companionship of the lions. Margaret found herself falling into an unexpected routine. Mornings began with Sophia's lessons. The girl was homeschooled, working through an advanced curriculum that suggested a brilliant but lonely mind. Then came lunch, followed by what Sophia called lion time. This was when Margaret truly began to understand the bizarre reality of the Whitmore household. Sophia would sit in the main living room, a vast space with leather furniture and abstract art worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, and Zahara would join them. The lioness had her favorite spots, the area rug near the fireplace, the patch of sunlight by the south-facing windows, sometimes simply stretched across the cool marble floor like a massive, lethal cat. And Sophia would read to her. It was the strangest, most beautiful thing Margaret had ever witnessed. The small girl curled up against the lioness's flank, her book propped on Zahara's massive shoulder, reading aloud in her clear, precise voice. Stories about adventures, about distant lands, about families that stayed together. And Zahara would lie there, eyes half closed, occasionally shifting to get more comfortable, her breathing slow and deep. She likes the sound of voices, Sophia explained the first time Margaret observed this ritual. Daddy says she's lonely when we're not here. That's why she likes being inside. She wants to be part of our pride. Our pride. As if they were lions too, instead of fragile humans, one moment of instinct away from becoming prey. But here was the thing Margaret couldn't deny. In those moments, there was peace. Genuine peace. The kind she hadn't felt since before her mother's diagnosis, since before the world became a series of urgent problems demanding urgent solutions. Watching Sophia with Zahara, she saw something pure, a connection that transcended the boundaries humans insisted upon, a trust that seemed to flow both ways. And slowly, carefully, Margaret found herself drawn into that connection. It started small. Sitting in the same room, just being present. Then moving closer, until she too could feel the warmth radiating from Zahara's body. The lioness would watch her with those amber eyes, assessing, always assessing, but without aggression. More like consideration. One afternoon, about 10 days into her tenure, Sophia fell asleep against Zahara's side, her book sliding from her hand. Margaret moved to pick it up, and as she did, her hand brushed against Zahara's fur. She froze, expecting the lioness to react, but Zahara simply continued her slow breathing, undisturbed. The fur was coarser than Margaret had imagined, each strand thick and wiry, warm from the sun that streamed through the windows. Underneath, she could feel the solid mass of muscle, the raw power contained in that deceptively relaxed posture. Margaret found herself stroking gently, experimentally, the way she might pet a dog. Except this was no dog. This was a predator whose ancestors had ruled the African plains for millennia, whose DNA carried the memory of hunts and kills and survival at its most brutal. And yet, under Margaret's hand, Zahara made a sound, that low chuffing noise Margaret had heard before, but softer now, almost contented. "She likes you," Sophia murmured, not quite asleep after all. She doesn't let everyone touch her. Only me and Daddy and Victor. Now you. The privilege of that, the strange, impossible privilege of being trusted by something so magnificent and deadly, brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. When had she last felt chosen? When had anyone or anything looked at her and decided she was worth trusting? From that day forward, something shifted. Margaret stopped seeing Zahara as simply a dangerous animal to be managed and started seeing her as, she wasn't quite sure what. Not a pet, certainly. The word seemed insulting applied to something so inherently wild. But perhaps a companion. A presence that demanded respect and offered, in return, something equally valuable. The other two lions, however, remained different. Cassie, the younger female, was nervous and aggressive, pacing her outdoor enclosure with agitation whenever Margaret approached. Victor explained that she'd been rescued from a facility that bred lions for trophy hunting, spending her first 2 years in deplorable conditions. She doesn't trust humans, he said, his weather-beaten face grim. Can't say I blame her. And Tao, the male. Tao was something else entirely. Massive, scarred, with a mane that seemed to hold shadows within its depths, he watched everything with cold calculation. When Margaret's eyes met his through the reinforced glass of his enclosure, she saw no curiosity, no potential for connection. Only hunger. Tao came from a circus, Sophia had told her, her voice dropping to a whisper. They hurt him. Made him do tricks with fire. Daddy rescued him, but Tao never forgave people. He only tolerates Daddy and Victor, and even then, you can see he's always thinking about it. Thinking about what? Margaret had asked, though she knew the answer. Thinking about killing them. He's just waiting for the right moment. It should have been a warning. Perhaps it was. But Margaret had convinced herself that as long as she focused on Sophia and her relationship with Zahara, as long as she stayed aware and careful, everything would be manageable. She had no idea how wrong she was. No idea that the fragile piece of the Whitmore estate was built on foundations far more unstable than she'd imagined. No idea that Richard Whitmore's arrival would shatter everything she thought she understood about this strange world she'd entered. And no idea that what she was about to discover would force her to make a choice between her own safety and a truth that demanded to be revealed, no matter the cost. Richard Whitmore arrived on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Margaret had started working at the estate. She heard the helicopter before she saw it, the rhythmic thumping of rotors cutting through the quiet that had settled over the grounds after sunset. Sophia's face lit up with an expression Margaret had never seen before, pure, uncomplicated joy. Daddy's home. The girl abandoned her dinner and ran toward the entrance hall, all the careful composure she usually maintained dissolving into the excitement of a child who'd missed her father. Margaret followed more slowly, uncertain of what to expect. In the weeks she'd been there, Whitmore had become an enigma, a presence felt only through the choices he'd made. The lions, the isolation, the excessive wealth deployed in service of a lifestyle that seemed designed to keep the world at arm's length. He entered through the main doors like a king returning to his castle, and Margaret's first thought was that he looked nothing like his photographs. Oh, the features were the same, the sharp jawline, the piercing blue eyes, the silver-threaded dark hair, but the photographs had captured only surfaces. In person, Richard Whitmore radiated something else entirely. Power, certainly, but also a kind of restless energy, as if staying still required an effort of will. He wore an expensive suit that somehow looked out of place on him, as if he tolerated it rather than chose it. Princess! He swept Sophia into his arms, spinning her in a circle that made her laugh, and for a moment, he was simply a father, happy to see his daughter. Then his gaze found Margaret, and the warmth bled away, replaced by assessment. He set Sophia down carefully and approached, his hand extended. You must be Margaret Chen. Harrison tells me you've lasted longer than the others. His grip was firm, his palm calloused in a way that surprised her. These weren't the hands of a man who spent his life behind a desk. I'm trying my best, Mr. Whitmore. Richard, he corrected. Mr. Whitmore makes me sound like my father, and I spent my life ensuring I'm nothing like him. There was bitterness in those words, old and acidic. Walk with me. Sophia, go wash up for bed. I'll come say good night in an hour. It wasn't a request. Sophia recognized it too, her moment of joy fading into something more guarded. Yes, Daddy. She kissed his cheek and headed toward the stairs, glancing back at Margaret with an expression that might have been worry. Richard moved through the house with the fluid confidence of someone intimately familiar with every inch of it, leading Margaret toward the West Wing, an area she'd been told was off-limits, his private quarters. Harrison says Zahara has accepted you. That's unusual. She's particular about humans. Sophia says she's deciding if I'm part of the pride. He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his face. Smart child. Yes, that's exactly what she's doing. Lions are social animals, Miss Chen. They understand hierarchy, family structures, loyalty. Zahara was part of a pride before poachers killed her mother and siblings. She remembers. Deep in that magnificent brain, she remembers what it means to belong. They'd reached a set of double doors, which he opened to reveal something Margaret hadn't expected, a study that looked more like a naturalist's laboratory than an office. The walls were lined with books, yes, but also skulls, preserved specimens under glass, detailed anatomical drawings of big cats. A massive desk dominated one end, covered in papers and what looked like research journals. You're surprised, he observed, gesturing for her to sit in one of the leather chairs facing the desk. You thought I kept the lions as trophies. Status symbols for a rich man with more money than sense. I didn't. Don't lie. It's what everyone thinks. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter, handing her one without asking if she wanted it. The truth is more complicated. I studied zoology at university, before my father forced me into the family business. I was going to work in wildlife conservation, spend my life in Africa studying pride dynamics in the wild. Then he died, left me his pharmaceutical empire, and suddenly I had responsibilities, investors, thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on my success. He took a long drink, his eyes distant. I built it into something 10 times what he left me. Made millions, then billions. But every day I spent in boardrooms and on conference calls, I felt something dying inside me. The part that understood there's more to life than profit margins and stock prices. The part that knew humans aren't the apex of creation, just the most destructive. Margaret sipped her whiskey, feeling its burn, unsure how to respond. There was pain in his words, genuine pain, but also something else, a justification being constructed, brick by brick. So I saved Zahara, then Kasi, then Tao. Gave them a life here, where they're protected, cared for. Better than they'd have in the wild, honestly. No drought, no rival prides, no trophy hunters. And they gave me something in return. A connection to what matters. To what's real. What about Sophia? Margaret asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Growing up with lions, in isolation, is that what's real for a child? His eyes hardened, and Margaret saw a flash of something dangerous there, quickly controlled. Sophia understands more about authentic existence than any child raised in your conventional world. She knows that nature is both beautiful and brutal. She doesn't have illusions about her own importance. And she has something most children never experience, genuine connection with creatures that don't lie, don't manipulate, don't pretend. But she's lonely, Margaret pressed, emboldened by the whiskey and her growing concern for the girl she'd been caring for. She talks about the staff who leave like it's inevitable. Like she's not worth staying for. Richard stood abruptly, and Margaret tensed, wondering if she'd gone too far. But he didn't dismiss her. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out at the darkened grounds where, somewhere in the shadows, his lions prowled their enclosures. Her mother died because of human weakness, he said finally, his voice low. We were at a dinner party, the kind of vapid, meaningless gathering I despised even then. Maria got drunk, wanted to drive home. I should have stopped her, but we'd been fighting, and I was too proud, too angry. She crashed into a tree 3 miles from here. Killed instantly. The pain in his words was raw, unhealed despite the years. Sophia was with her. 3 years old, strapped in her car seat. She spent 4 hours trapped in that car with her mother's body before someone found them. 4 hours, Miss Chen. Do you understand what that does to a child? What kind of trust it destroys? Margaret felt her throat tighten. I'm sorry. I didn't know. How could you? He turned back to face her. Sophia doesn't trust easily because humans have taught her they're unreliable. They drink, they fight, they die. But Zahara is constant, loyal, present. The lions give Sophia something I can't. Certainty. They are exactly what they appear to be, every single day. The logic was twisted, but Margaret could see its appeal. Could see how a man drowning in guilt might convince himself that raising his daughter among predators was protection rather than danger. I need you to understand something, Richard continued, his intensity ratcheting up. I don't need another caregiver who's just here for a paycheck, counting the days until she can leave. Sophia needs someone who sees what I've built here, who understands that we're not a normal family because normal families are fundamentally broken. Can you be that person? It was a test, Margaret realized. Everything since he'd walked through the door had been a test. And she had a choice. She could give him the answer he wanted to hear, could play along with his narrative, could collect her generous salary and ignore the growing unease in her gut. Or she could be honest. I can be someone who stays, she said carefully. Someone who cares about Sophia's well-being above everything else. But I can't promise to agree with all your choices, Mr. Whitmore. That wouldn't be honest, and you said you don't want lies. For a long moment he stared at her, and Margaret wondered if she was about to be fired. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a genuine sound, surprised and approving. Harrison was right about you. You have spine. Good. Sophia needs someone with spine. So do the lions, for that matter. They smell weakness the way sharks smell blood. He raised his glass in a toast. To honesty, then. And to what happens when we stop pretending the world is safe and start accepting it for what it really is. Beautiful, terrible, and completely indifferent to our survival. Margaret clinked her glass against his, but she didn't drink. Because in that moment, watching Richard Whitmore's eyes gleam with something between conviction and madness, she realized that she'd just been given access to something dangerous. Not the lions themselves, but the mind that had created this entire surreal world. And she had no idea yet that the danger went far deeper than unconventional parenting or ethical questions about keeping wild animals. That there were secrets in this mansion that Richard Whitmore had shared with no one, not even his lawyer, not even Victor. Secrets that Margaret was about to stumble into, changing everything she thought she knew about why the lions were really here, and what Richard Whitmore truly believed about the boundary between human and animal, civilization and wilderness, love and possession. The change in the household dynamics with Richard home was immediate and unsettling. He threw himself into what he called quality time with Sophia. Hours spent in the outdoor enclosures with Zahara, watching the lions move through their territory, teaching Sophia to read their body language and understand their communication. See how Zahara's tail twitches. Richard would explain, his hand resting protectively on Sophia's shoulder as they observed from behind the safety of reinforced glass. She's irritated. Probably because Cassie keeps approaching her favorite resting spot. Watch what happens next. And Sophia would watch with rapt attention, absorbing her father's lessons about dominance and submission, about the subtle hierarchies that governed pride life, about respect earned through strength. Margaret joined these sessions, and what struck her most wasn't the information itself. Richard clearly had deep knowledge about lion behavior, but the way he spoke about it. Not as an observer studying animals, but as someone who believed he was part of their world. He spoke about pride rules and natural order with the fervor of a religious convert, as if he'd found truth in the social structures of predators that human society lacked. Humans complicate everything with morality, he said during one session, while Zahara groomed herself in a patch of afternoon sunlight. We create artificial rules about fairness and equality that have no basis in nature. But lions? Lions understand what we've forgotten, that hierarchy is necessary, that strength matters, that the pride survives because everyone knows their role. But humans aren't lions, Margaret ventured carefully. Aren't we? His smile was sharp. Strip away our technology, our laws, our civilized veneer, and what are we? Social primates with the same drives, the same need for structure, the same capacity for violence when threatened. We've just gotten better at lying about it. Sophia listened to these conversations with a disturbing level of acceptance, as if her father's philosophy was simply how the world worked. And maybe, in her limited experience, it was. She'd grown up in an environment where strength, Richard's wealth, the lion's physical power, determined reality. Where else would she have learned differently? But it was what happened at night that truly disturbed Margaret. She'd been sleeping in her quarters in the East Wing, a comfortable suite that felt more like a luxury hotel room than staff housing. But 3 nights after Richard's return, she was awakened by a sound, low, rhythmic, carrying through the ventilation system in a way that made her skin prickle. Chanting. Someone was chanting. Margaret rose, pulled on her robe, and followed the sound through the darkened hallways. It led her to the West Wing, to an area beyond Richard's study that she'd never explored. A door stood slightly ajar, and through it, she could see flickering light, candles, dozens of them. She should have turned back. Should have respected the boundaries of her employer's privacy. But something compelled her forward, some instinct that whispered this was important, that this was the missing piece that would explain the wrongness she'd been sensing. Through the gap in the door, Margaret saw a room that defied explanation. The walls were covered in drawings, crude, almost primitive, depicting figures that were half human, half lion. Some showed people transforming, their bodies caught mid-change between forms. Others showed rituals, circles of people surrounding lions, their hands raised in what looked like worship. And in the center of it all stood Richard Whitmore, shirtless, his body painted with symbols that matched those on the walls. He held something in his hands, a skull, weathered and ancient, possibly lion, possibly something else. The candles cast dancing shadows that made it seem as if the room itself was breathing. His chanting was in a language Margaret didn't recognize, guttural and rhythmic, rising and falling in intensity. And as she watched, frozen in shock and disbelief, Zahara padded into view from somewhere beyond Margaret's line of sight. The lioness moved to Richard's side, and he placed his hand on her head, his chanting growing louder. Then he knelt, pressing his forehead against Zahara's, his body shaking with either emotion or exhaustion. "Teach me," he whispered, his voice breaking through the chanting. "Show me how to shed this weak human form. Let me be worthy of the pride. Let me be clean of everything that makes me human, the guilt, the shame, the crippling awareness of mortality. Let me be perfect, like you. Let me be free." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. This wasn't conservation. This wasn't even eccentricity. This was something else entirely. Obsession, delusion, possibly madness. Richard Whitmore wasn't keeping lions because he loved them. He was keeping them because he wanted to become one. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering, making it back to her room without being discovered. But sleep was impossible. Her mind raced, trying to process what she'd witnessed, trying to decide what it meant for Sophia, for the lions, for her own safety. In the morning, Richard appeared at breakfast as if nothing had happened, charming and attentive with Sophia, politely inquiring about Margaret's plans for the day's lessons. There was no trace of the man she'd seen in that candlelit room, no hint of the desperate longing in his voice as he'd begged a lion to transform him into something other than human. But Margaret couldn't unsee it. And as the days passed, she began noticing other things. The way Richard would sometimes stop mid-sentence when talking to Sophia, his eyes losing focus as if listening to something only he could hear. The way he'd touch his own skin with visible disgust. The way he spent longer and longer in the enclosures, even when the afternoon heat became oppressive, as if testing himself, pushing his body to adapt to conditions suited for savanna predators rather than humans. "Daddy says we're all just animals pretending to be gods," Sophia mentioned casually one day, while working on her mathematics. "But the lions never pretend. That's why they're better." Better. The word echoed in Margaret's mind. Better than what? better than us? She thought about calling Harrison, about expressing her concerns through official channels. But what would she say? My employer chants at lions in a room covered with transformation art? He's philosophically convinced that being human is a weakness? Neither of those things was illegal, and given the NDAs she'd signed, trying to report them might result in legal consequences for her. More importantly, what about Sophia? If Margaret left, if she reported Richard's behavior and triggered some investigation, what happened to the girl? Foster care? Another institutional setting where she'd be traumatized all over again? And beneath all of that, beneath the fear and the concern, was something else Margaret didn't want to acknowledge. A strange, compelling fascination. Because when she watched Richard with the lions, when she saw the raw intensity of his connection with them, she couldn't deny that there was something powerful there. Something that resonated with her own growing relationship with Zahara. Her own sense that these creatures offered access to a kind of truth that human society obscured. Was it possible he was right? Not about transformation, that was clearly impossible, but about the fundamental question? Had humans lost something essential by separating themselves so completely from nature? By building walls and rules and civilizations that protected us from ever facing the raw reality of existence? Margaret found herself spending more time with Zahara, drawn by questions she couldn't articulate. And the lioness seemed to sense something, her attention focusing more intensely on Margaret, as if she too was trying to communicate something important. It was Victor, surprisingly, who provided the first real warning. He found Margaret one afternoon in the outdoor enclosure, sitting in the shade while Zahara dozed nearby. "You're getting close to her," he observed, his weathered face unreadable. "Is that a problem?" "Depends on what you think you're getting close to." He squatted down, his movements economical, a man who'd spent his life working with animals. "Zahara isn't a pet. She's not even really domesticated. She's a wild animal who's learned to tolerate certain humans under specific conditions. Don't confuse that tolerance for safety." "I understand that. Do you?" Victor's eyes were sharp. "Because Richard doesn't. Hasn't for years. He thinks he's built some kind of connection, some bridge between species. But all he's really done is create an environment where disasters are waiting to happen. And when they do, it's going to be ugly." "What kind of disasters?" Victor stood, brushing dust from his jeans. "The kind where people get hurt. The kind where lions get put down because humans forgot they were lions. Richard sees what he wants to see. I see what's real. And what's real is 3 apex predators living in a house with a child, maintained by a man who's losing his grip on reality." He walked away before Margaret could respond, leaving her with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. That night, Margaret made a decision. She would document everything, Richard's behaviors, the strange ritual room, Victor's warnings. She would keep records, carefully hidden, so that if something did happen, if Sophia was endangered, there would be evidence. Not to betray Richard necessarily, but to protect the innocent parties in this increasingly surreal situation. It seemed like a reasonable precaution, a responsible choice. She had no idea that her documentation, her careful observations, would soon become evidence in a situation far more terrible than anything she'd imagined. That the disaster Victor warned about was already in motion, set into place by forces she hadn't yet recognized. And that when everything finally exploded into violence and revelation, the question of who was predator and who was prey would become impossible to answer. It happened 6 weeks into Margaret's employment, on a night when the air itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Sophia had gone to bed early, tired from a day spent helping Victor clean the enclosures, one of her favorite activities, which Richard encouraged as understanding the reality of the pride. Margaret had been in her room, reviewing her hidden notes, when she heard raised voices from the main floor. Richard's voice, tight with anger. "I don't care what the board thinks. They don't understand what we're building here." A woman's voice, unfamiliar to Margaret. "What you're building? Richard, you've abandoned the company. You miss meetings, ignore investor calls. The pharmaceutical division is hemorrhaging value because their CEO is too busy playing with his pets to do his job. Margaret moved to her door, opening it slightly. Below, in the grand entrance hall, Richard stood facing a woman in an expensive business suit, her blonde hair pulled back severely, her posture radiating frustration. "Everything I built is meaningless, Claire." Richard's voice had dropped dangerously low. "Products that keep sick people just healthy enough to keep buying more products. A system designed to profit from suffering. I won't participate in it anymore." "Then sell it. Step down. But don't destroy it through neglect. Thousands of employees depend on that company. Patients depend on those products. You have responsibilities." "I have one responsibility." Richard's hand gestured toward the staircase, toward where Sophia slept. "Raising my daughter to understand truth. Everything else is a lie we tell ourselves to pretend our lives have meaning." "Listen to yourself." Claire's voice rose again. "You sound insane. And frankly, the board agrees. We've consulted with attorneys, Richard. If you continue this way, we can have you declared incompetent. Remove you from decision-making. Appoint a trustee for Sophia." The silence that followed was absolute, charged with potential violence. Margaret saw Richard's body go rigid, his hands clenching into fists. Then, with visible effort, he unclenched them. "Get out," he said softly. "Get out of my house. And tell the board that if they try to interfere with my family, I will destroy them. I'll blow up the company, tank the stock, release every piece of dirty research we've ever buried. I'll burn it all down and salt the earth. Richard. Now." His roar was shocking in its intensity, raw and primal, more animal than human. Claire stumbled backward, fear flashing across her face, then turned and fled toward her car. Margaret heard the engine start, gravel spitting as the vehicle accelerated away from the mansion. Richard stood alone in the entrance hall, his chest heaving, his face twisted with rage and something else, desperation. Then he noticed Margaret watching from above. Their eyes met, and for a moment, she saw something terrible there, a man standing at the edge of an abyss, holding on by his fingernails, knowing he was slipping. "How much did you hear?" His voice was carefully controlled now, but the wildness was still there, just beneath the surface. "Enough." Margaret descended the stairs slowly. "Mr. Whitmore, Richard, are you all right?" He laughed, the sound hollow. "Am I all right? What an absurd question. None of us are all right, Margaret. We're all just pretending, performing the roles society assigned us, slowly dying inside from the meaninglessness of it all." "That's not true. Isn't it?" He moved toward her, and Margaret had to force herself not to back away. "Tell me, what gives your life meaning? Your dying mother? The medical bills crushing you? The job that pays you to witness my family's dysfunction? We're all trapped, Margaret. The only difference is most people can't see the bars of their cage. And you think the lions are your way out?" The question hung between them, dangerous and intimate. Richard's eyes searched her face, looking for judgment, for mockery, finding only genuine curiosity. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "I want to show you something." He led her through the house to the ritual room, not bothering with pretense anymore. In the candlelight, the drawings on the walls seemed even more unsettling, the half-human, half-lion figures appearing to move in the flickering shadows. "Do you know what the ancient Egyptians believed?" Richard asked, lighting more candles. "They believed that the gods could take animal forms, that there were beings who existed between human and animal, who possessed the power of both and the limitations of neither. Therianthropy, the transformation between forms. That's mythology, Richard. It's not real. Isn't it?" He pulled out a weathered journal, its pages covered in handwritten notes and sketches. "I've spent years researching. There are cultures all over the world with stories of transformation. Shamans who claim to have walked in animal bodies. People who swear they've witnessed the impossible." Margaret looked at the journal, recognizing the descent into obsession. "Even if those stories were true, and they're not, what does that have to do with you? With Sophia. Because I can feel it. His voice dropped to a whisper, raw with conviction. When I'm with the lions, when I'm in the enclosure and the rest of the world fades away, I can feel something shifting inside me. Something primal awakening. Margaret, what if we're not meant to be just one thing? What if the cage we're trapped in is the human form itself? Richard, you need help. Professional help. What you're describing sounds like madness. He smiled, but there was pain in it. Perhaps. Or perhaps I'm the only sane one, and the rest of you are sleepwalking through life, never questioning why we're so desperate to be anything other than what we are. Margaret took a breath, choosing her words carefully. What about Sophia? Have you thought about how this affects her? Growing up with a father who believes he's becoming a lion, isolated from other children, surrounded by actual predators. Sophia understands more than you think. But even as he said it, doubt flickered across his face. She's connected to the lions in ways even I'm not. She's young enough, pure enough, unspoiled by society's lies. She's a child who deserves a childhood. Margaret's voice was firmer now. Not a role in her father's spiritual crisis. And if you can't see that, then maybe Claire was right. Maybe Sophia does need protection, from you. The slap of those words was visible. Richard recoiled as if she'd struck him physically, his expression cycling through shock, rage, and finally, something that might have been clarity. Get out, he said quietly. Leave this room. I need to think. Margaret left, her heart pounding, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake. But as she climbed the stairs back to her quarters, she heard Sophia's voice, small and frightened, calling from her room. Margaret, what's happening? Why was Daddy yelling? She found Sophia standing at her window, looking down at the enclosures where the lions paced in the moonlight, agitated by the raised voices, by the tension that had infected the household. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Margaret sat on the bed, and Sophia immediately crawled into her lap, something she rarely did. The girl had learned not to seek comfort, expecting it would be withdrawn. He's getting worse, isn't he? Sophia's voice was matter-of-fact, but Margaret felt her trembling. The lion thing. He thinks he's becoming one of them. You know about that? I've known for a while. He talks to them at night. Tells them things. Sometimes I think. Sophia paused, her small hands clutching Margaret's arms. Sometimes I think he loves them more than me. Because they're what he wants to be, and I'm just a reminder of what he's trying to escape. The sophisticated understanding in those words, coming from a 7-year-old, broke Margaret's heart. Your father loves you, Sophia. He's just confused right now. Will you leave? The question was direct, those sharp eyes searching Margaret's face. Like all the others. Now that you've seen how bad it is. And there it was, the impossible choice Margaret had been avoiding. Stay, and be complicit in an increasingly unstable situation that endangered a child. Or leave, and become another person who abandoned Sophia when she needed someone most. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret heard herself say. Not unless you want me to. Sophia's hug was fierce, desperate. Don't go. Please don't go. You're the only one who's ever stayed. As Margaret held the trembling child, she looked out the window at the lions below, their eyes reflecting moonlight like distant stars, and she wondered what she'd just committed herself to. How far she would go to protect this broken little girl in a household sliding towards some kind of catastrophe. She didn't have to wonder long. Because 3 days later, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, in a sequence of events so terrible that they would force Margaret to do the one thing she'd sworn she would never do. The thing that would change everything forever, exposing truths that Richard Whitmore had hidden not just from the world, but from himself. And it would all begin with a simple mistake, the kind that happens in seconds and echoes for lifetimes. The day started normally, which should have been Margaret's first warning. After the confrontation, Richard had been subdued, spending hours alone in the ritual room or out in the enclosures. He was civil with Margaret but distant, as if her words had created a chasm between them he wasn't sure how to cross. Sophia had been quiet too, clinging to her routines with the desperate precision of a child trying to maintain control in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Morning lessons, lunch, lion time with Zahara. The same patterns, day after day, as if repetition could keep chaos at bay. It was Victor's day off, which meant Richard was responsible for feeding the lions, a task he usually relished, viewing it as a chance to demonstrate dominance and reinforce the pride hierarchy. Margaret had watched him do it before, always careful, always methodical, following protocols that ensured safety. But on this day, something was different. She noticed it in the way Richard prepared the food, his movements rushed, distracted. In the way he kept touching the ritual markings he'd painted on his forearms that morning, symbols that hadn't been there yesterday. "Richard," Margaret said carefully, "maybe we should wait for Victor. You seem tired." "I'm fine." His tone was sharp. "This is my pride. I don't need Victor or anyone else to tell me how to care for them." Sophia glanced at Margaret, worry in her eyes, but said nothing. They followed Richard to the outdoor enclosures, where Cassie and Tao waited, their powerful bodies tense with anticipation. Zahara was inside the house. She'd been lethargic that morning, possibly coming down with something, and Richard had decided to let her rest. The feeding protocol was straightforward. Place the meat in the designated areas using long tools, ensuring you never entered the enclosure while the lions had access to it, secure all gates, then release the lions from their night rooms. Simple, safe, practiced hundreds of times. But Richard was improvising. "I'm going in with them," he announced, his hand on the main gate. "It's time to prove that I'm truly part of this pride. No more barriers. No more pretense of separation. No." Margaret's voice was sharp with alarm. "Richard, that's insane. You'll get yourself killed." "Will I?" His eyes held that wild light she'd seen in the ritual room. "Or will they finally accept me? Recognize me as one of them? There's only one way to find out." "Daddy, please don't." Sophia's voice was small, terrified. "Please. You're scaring me." For a moment, Richard hesitated, his daughter's fear penetrating whatever delusion was driving him. Then his expression hardened. "You need to see this, Sophia. Both of you. You need to understand that everything you've been taught about the separation between human and animal is a lie." He opened the gate. Everything that happened next occurred with terrible slowness and impossible speed simultaneously. Richard stepped into the enclosure, his body language attempting confidence but betraying uncertainty. Cassie and Tao, confused by the breach of protocol, by the human entering their territory during feeding time, by the scent of adrenaline and fear radiating from Richard despite his bravado, responded the way apex predators respond to confusion, with aggression. Tao moved first, his massive body launching forward with shocking speed. Not a full attack, not yet, a warning, a rush meant to establish dominance, to drive the intruder back. But Richard, instead of retreating, stood his ground, shouting something that might have been words or might have been pure sound. And that's when Cassie struck. She came from the side, her damaged psyche interpreting Richard's presence as threat, her history of abuse flooding back in an instant. Her jaws closed on Richard's forearm, the one decorated with ritual symbols, and the sound of bones breaking was audible even from where Margaret stood. Richard's scream was purely human, all pretense of transformation shattered by the reality of violence. He fell, and Tao was there, not yet attacking but circling, growling, confused by the blood, by the screaming, by the violation of every routine they'd established. Margaret acted on instinct. She grabbed the emergency pole, a long tool with a padded hook used to separate fighting lions, and thrust it through the fence, trying to push Cassie away from Richard. "Sophia, run. Get inside and call Harrison. Now." But Sophia was frozen, her small body rigid with horror, watching her father being mauled by the creatures he believed would accept him as family. Margaret did the only thing she could think of. She opened the gate to Zahara's section of the compound, where the older lioness had been resting, hoping that Zahara's dominance over the younger lions would override their aggression. Zahara emerged slowly, assessing the situation with the wisdom of age. She saw Richard on the ground, Cassie still latched onto his arm, Tao circling with increasing agitation. She saw Margaret, saw Sophia frozen by the fence. And she roared. The sound was apocalyptic, a declaration of authority that seemed to shake the air itself. Margaret, what's happening? Why was Daddy yelling? She found Sophia standing at her window, looking down at the enclosures where the lions paced in the moonlight, agitated by the raised voices, by the tension that had infected the household. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Margaret sat on the bed, and Sophia immediately crawled into her lap, something she rarely did. The girl had learned not to seek comfort, expecting it would be withdrawn. He's getting worse, isn't he? Sophia's voice was matter-of-fact, but Margaret felt her trembling. The lion thing. He thinks he's becoming one of them. You know about that? I've known for a while. He talks to them at night. Tells them things. Sometimes I think. Sophia paused, her small hands clutching Margaret's arms. Sometimes I think he loves them more than me. Because they're what he wants to be, and I'm just a reminder of what he's trying to escape. The sophisticated understanding in those words, coming from a 7-year-old, broke Margaret's heart. Your father loves you, Sophia. He's just confused right now. Will you leave? The question was direct, those sharp eyes searching Margaret's face. Like all the others. Now that you've seen how bad it is. And there it was, the impossible choice Margaret had been avoiding. Stay, and be complicit in an increasingly unstable situation that endangered a child. Or leave, and become another person who abandoned Sophia when she needed someone most. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret heard herself say. Not unless you want me to. Sophia's hug was fierce, desperate. Don't go. Please don't go. You're the only one who's ever stayed. As Margaret held the trembling child, she looked out the window at the lions below, their eyes reflecting moonlight like distant stars, and she wondered what she'd just committed herself to. How far she would go to protect this broken little girl in a household sliding towards some kind of catastrophe. She didn't have to wonder long. Because 3 days later, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, in a sequence of events so terrible that they would force Margaret to do the one thing she'd sworn she would never do, the thing that would change everything forever, exposing truths that Richard Whitmore had hidden not just from the world, but from himself. And it would all begin with a simple mistake, the kind that happens in seconds and echoes for lifetimes. The day started normally, which should have been Margaret's first warning. After the confrontation, Richard had been subdued, spending hours alone in the ritual room or out in the enclosures. He was civil with Margaret but distant, as if her words had created a chasm between them he wasn't sure how to cross. Sophia had been quiet too, clinging to her routines with the desperate precision of a child trying to maintain control in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Morning lessons, lunch, lion time with Zahara. The same patterns, day after day, as if repetition could keep chaos at bay. It was Victor's day off, which meant Richard was responsible for feeding the lions, a task he usually relished, viewing it as a chance to demonstrate dominance and reinforce the pride hierarchy. Margaret had watched him do it before, always careful, always methodical, following protocols that ensured safety. But on this day, something was different. She noticed it in the way Richard prepared the food, his movements rushed, distracted. In the way he kept touching the ritual markings he'd painted on his forearms that morning, symbols that hadn't been there yesterday. Richard, Margaret said carefully, maybe we should wait for Victor. You seem tired. I'm fine. His tone was sharp. This is my pride. I don't need Victor or anyone else to tell me how to care for them. Sophia glanced at Margaret, worry in her eyes, but said nothing. They followed Richard to the outdoor enclosures, where Cassie and Tao waited, their powerful bodies tense with anticipation. Zahara was inside the house. She'd been lethargic that morning, possibly coming down with something, and Richard had decided to let her rest. The feeding protocol was straightforward. Place the meat in the designated areas using long tools, ensuring you never entered the enclosure while the lions had access to it, secure all gates, then release the lions from their night rooms. Simple, safe, practiced hundreds of times. But Richard was improvising. I'm going in with them, he announced, his hand on the main gate. It's time to prove that I'm truly part of this pride. No more barriers. No more pretense of separation. No. Margaret's voice was sharp with alarm. Richard, that's insane. You'll get yourself killed. Will I? His eyes held that wild light she'd seen in the ritual room. Or will they finally accept me? Recognize me as one of them? There's only one way to find out. Daddy, please don't. Sophia's voice was small, terrified. Please. You're scaring me. For a moment, Richard hesitated, his daughter's fear penetrating whatever delusion was driving him. Then his expression hardened. You need to see this, Sophia. Both of you. You need to understand that everything you've been taught about the separation between human and animal is a lie. He opened the gate. Everything that happened next occurred with terrible slowness and impossible speed simultaneously. Richard stepped into the enclosure, his body language attempting confidence but betraying uncertainty. Cassie and Tao, confused by the breach of protocol, by the human entering their territory during feeding time, by the scent of adrenaline and fear radiating from Richard despite his bravado, responded the way apex predators respond to confusion, with aggression. Tao moved first, his massive body launching forward with shocking speed. Not a full attack, not yet, a warning, a rush meant to establish dominance, to drive the intruder back. But Richard, instead of retreating, stood his ground, shouting something that might have been words or might have been pure sound. And that's when Cassie struck. She came from the side, her damaged psyche interpreting Richard's presence as threat, her history of abuse flooding back in an instant. Her jaws closed on Richard's forearm, the one decorated with ritual symbols, and the sound of bones breaking was audible even from where Margaret stood. Richard's scream was purely human, all pretense of transformation shattered by the reality of violence. He fell, and Tao was there, not yet attacking but circling, growling, confused by the blood, by the screaming, by the violation of every routine they'd established. Margaret acted on instinct. She grabbed the emergency pole, a long tool with a padded hook used to separate fighting lions, and thrust it through the fence, trying to push Cassie away from Richard. Sophia, run. Get inside and call Harrison. Now. But Sophia was frozen, her small body rigid with horror, watching her father being mauled by the creatures he believed would accept him as family. Margaret did the only thing she could think of. She opened the gate to Zahara's section of the compound, where the older lioness had been resting, hoping that Zahara's dominance over the younger lions would override their aggression. Zahara emerged slowly, assessing the situation with the wisdom of age. She saw Richard on the ground, Cassie still latched onto his arm, Tao circling with increasing agitation. She saw Margaret, saw Sophia frozen by the fence. And she roared. The sound was apocalyptic, a declaration of authority that seemed to shake the air itself. And everywhere, photographs of lions, close-ups of their eyes, their neural pathways, anatomical studies that showed their musculature and skeletal structure in excruciating detail. Margaret moved deeper into the room, her unease growing with each step. This wasn't the workspace of someone casually interested in wildlife. This was the workspace of someone conducting research, serious research, following a hypothesis toward some kind of conclusion. On the main desk, she found a journal, not the weathered one Richard had shown her before, but a new one, its pages filled with recent entries written in Richard's precise handwriting. She opened it, and the first page made her knees weak. Project Transformation, Year 7. If the human consciousness can be altered, why not the human form? We've proven neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself. We've mapped the genetic similarities between humans and other mammals. We've documented cases of body dysmorphia where people perceive themselves as different than they are. But what if it goes deeper? What if the boundary between species is more permeable than we think? What if, with the right combination of pharmaceutical intervention, genetic therapy, and consciousness alteration, we could trigger genuine transformation? The Egyptians believed it. The shamans believed it. Every culture has stories of shapeshifters, work creatures, beings who cross the species barrier. What if they weren't myths? What if they were memories of something we've lost? I've spent 7 years developing the compounds, testing them on myself in gradually increasing doses, monitoring the changes, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Enhanced reflexes, altered perception, dreams so vivid they might be something more than dreams. But I need to go further. The pharmaceutical approach alone isn't enough. I need to understand the consciousness itself, to map it, to find the bridge between human neural patterns and lion neural patterns, to prove that transformation is possible. Margaret's hands shook as she turned the pages. Entry after entry detailed Richard's experiments on himself, injections of compounds he'd synthesized using his pharmaceutical knowledge, monitoring of physiological changes, increasingly delusional interpretations of normal human experiences as evidence of transformation. Then she found the entries about Sophia. She's the key. 7 years old, the same age as the lions I've studied. Her brain is still developing, still plastic, still capable of forming new neural pathways. If I could just... The entry stopped there, as if Richard had caught himself, pulled back from whatever thought had been forming. But the implications were clear, horrifying. He'd been considering experimenting on his own daughter. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. She continued reading, finding more recent entries. Claire's threat changes everything. If they take Sophia, if they declare me incompetent, the research ends. The transformation ends. I'll be trapped in this human form forever, my one chance at transcendence stolen by people too blind to see what I'm trying to achieve. I need to prove it works. Need to show everyone that the boundary between human and animal is artificial, that we can cross it, that we can evolve beyond our limited human consciousness into something pure, something perfect. The ritual room helps. The symbols, the chanting, they're not superstition. They're focusing mechanisms, ways to prime my consciousness for transformation. And the lions feel it. I know they do. Especially Zahara. She looks at me differently now, as if she recognizes something kindred. Tomorrow, I'll take the final step. Enter the enclosure during feeding time. Force the confrontation. Either they'll accept me as pride, as true kin, or perhaps that's part of it too. Perhaps you have to be willing to die as human to be reborn as something more. The date on that entry was today. Margaret's breath came in short gasps. Richard hadn't been delusional when he entered the enclosure, or rather, he had been, but it was a calculated delusion, a suicide or transcendence moment engineered by a man who'd poisoned himself with experimental drugs for 7 years in pursuit of an impossible dream. And he'd been willing to experiment on Sophia. She needed to call someone, Child Protective Services, the police, someone who could remove Sophia from this environment permanently. But first, she needed more evidence. Needed to find the compounds Richard had been using, the documentation that would prove what he'd done. She opened drawers, finding vials of clear liquid labeled with chemical formulas she didn't recognize. Files containing blood work results showing abnormal levels of various hormones and neurotransmitters. Medical scans of Richard's brain showing changes over time, nothing dramatic enough to indicate obvious damage, but subtle alterations in activity patterns that the notes suggested were consistent with cross-species neural development. Which was insane. Neural patterns didn't cross species. The human brain couldn't rewire itself to function like a lion's brain. That wasn't how biology worked. But then Margaret found something that made her question everything she thought she understood about the limits of science. A sealed file, marked Patient 0, Baseline Studies. Inside were medical records for someone named Robert Whitmore, Richard's father, she realized, doing the math on the dates. Records showing brain scans, blood work, behavioral assessments. And a series of photographs that showed a man deteriorating over time, his posture changing, his facial expressions becoming increasingly animal-like. The final report, written in clinical language that barely disguised the horror, detailed Robert Whitmore's complete mental breakdown. How he'd begun refusing cooked food, eating only raw meat. How he'd started sleeping on the floor, refusing furniture. How he'd attacked a nurse, biting her with such force that he'd nearly severed her finger. How he'd died in a psychiatric facility, still believing he was something other than human. And at the bottom of the file, a note in Richard's handwriting. Father tried this with chemical intervention alone. It destroyed him because he had no control group, no way to understand the consciousness he was trying to access. But I have the lions. I can observe them, study them, learn from them. I won't make his mistakes. I'll succeed where he failed. Margaret sat down heavily in Richard's chair, the pieces clicking into place. Richard wasn't the first Whitmore to pursue transformation. His father had attempted it, had gone mad in the process, and Richard, instead of learning the obvious lesson about the dangers of such experiments, had doubled down, convinced he could succeed where his father had failed. And he'd brought Sophia into this madness, raising her with lions not just because he believed in some spiritual connection, but because he was studying her, preparing her, potentially grooming her to be the next generation of his delusional research. The sound of a car in the driveway made Margaret jump. She looked out the window and saw Harrison's black Mercedes pulling up. He must have been contacted about Richard's attack, must be here to assess the situation, to manage whatever legal and PR nightmares were about to unfold. Margaret made a decision. She pulled out her phone and began taking photographs of the journal entries, of the vials, of Robert Whitmore's medical records, of everything that documented the depth of Richard's obsession. Evidence that would prove Sophia needed to be removed from this environment, that Richard needed psychiatric treatment, that this entire situation was far more dangerous than anyone on the outside realized. But as she worked, something nagged at her. Zahara's intervention. The way the lioness had positioned herself, had held back the younger lions, had seemed to understand that Richard needed protection. What if there was something to Richard's research? Not transformation, obviously, that was impossible. But what if his pharmaceutical experiments had created some kind of connection? Some neurological bridge that allowed for communication beyond what should be possible between species? No. That way lay the same madness that had consumed Richard and his father. Margaret forced herself to focus on the facts. Richard had poisoned himself with experimental drugs, had created a dangerous environment for his daughter, had allowed his obsession to override basic parental responsibility. And now she had the evidence to prove it. She finished photographing everything, then carefully returned items to their places. Harrison couldn't know she'd been here, couldn't know what she'd discovered, not yet. First, she needed to get these photographs to the right authorities, needed to ensure Sophia's safety was prioritized. But as Margaret left the office, closing the hidden door behind her, she took one last look at the ritual room, at the drawings of transformation, at the desperate hope painted on those walls by a man who'd convinced himself that being human was a prison rather than a gift. And despite everything, despite the danger, despite the madness, despite the clear evidence of Richard's delusions, she felt a flicker of understanding. Because wasn't that what people did when life became unbearable? Invented elaborate fantasies about becoming something else, something stronger, something free from pain and responsibility and the crushing weight of human consciousness? Richard's mistake wasn't dreaming of transformation. It was believing the dream could become real, and dragging his daughter into it. Margaret would make sure Sophia escaped before Richard's delusions destroyed her too. She would be the one who finally did the right thing, the responsible thing, the thing every other caregiver should have done years ago. She would break her NDA, expose Richard's research, and save that little girl from a father whose love had curdled into something monstrous. At least, that's what she told herself as she climbed the stairs to check on Sophia, who'd returned from the hospital with Harrison after leaving Richard in emergency surgery. She had no idea that Sophia had secrets too, or that the truth about the Whitmore household was stranger and more terrible than anything Margaret had discovered in Richard's office. Or that by tomorrow, everything would change again, in ways that would force Margaret to question not just Richard's sanity, but her own understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where the boundaries between species might be more fluid than anyone wanted to admit. Sophia was sitting in her room when Margaret found her, cross-legged on her bed, unnaturally still. The girl's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but there was something else in her expression, a knowing quality that made Margaret pause in the doorway. "How is he?" Margaret asked gently. "They had to take his arm." Sophia's voice was flat, emotionless. "Harrison said Daddy will live, but the damage was too severe. They amputated below the elbow. Margaret sat beside her, wanting to offer comfort but unsure how. "I'm so sorry, Sophia. That must be terrifying to hear." He brought it on himself. The coldness in those words, coming from a 7-year-old about her father, was chilling. He always brings it on himself. The experiments, the rituals, the obsession. I knew something bad would happen eventually. "Sophia, what do you mean by experiments?" The girl looked at her directly, and Margaret saw something ancient in those young eyes. "You found his office, didn't you? The hidden one. You know about the transformation research." Margaret's heart skipped. "How do you?" "Because I've been watching him for years, just like he's been watching the lions. I know about Grandfather Robert. I know about the compounds Daddy makes. I know about the plan he had for me." She stood and moved to her desk, pulling out a notebook of her own. "I started keeping records when I was 5. Everything he did, everything he said. I knew someone would need evidence eventually, when it all fell apart." Margaret took the notebook with trembling hands. Sophia's childish handwriting detailed observations that no child should have had to make. Dates when Richard injected himself with compounds, behavioral changes she'd noticed afterward, conversations she'd overheard about crossing the threshold and achieving transformation. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who would believe me?" Sophia's pragmatism was heartbreaking. A child saying her millionaire father was crazy? "They'd think I was making it up. Or they'd think I was the crazy one. I needed to wait until I had enough evidence, until someone else saw it too." "Sophia, I need to know, did your father ever give you any of these compounds? Did he experiment on you?" For the first time, something cracked in Sophia's careful control. Tears welled in her eyes. "He tried once. When I was 6. He said it was just vitamins, but I'd watched him make it in his lab. I knew what it really was. I pretended to take it, then spit it out when he left. After that, I was always careful." The relief Margaret felt was overwhelming. At least Richard hadn't crossed that final line, hadn't actually poisoned his own daughter. But the fact that he'd tried, that Sophia had lived with that threat. "We need to get you out of here," Margaret said firmly. "I have evidence from his office. You have your records. Together, we can make sure you're placed somewhere safe, somewhere you can actually be a child." But Sophia shook her head. "You don't understand. It's not just about getting me away from Daddy. It's about the lions." "What about them?" Sophia stood and moved to her window, looking out at the enclosures. Daddy's research wasn't completely wrong. Not about transformation, that part was delusion. But about consciousness, about the connections between species. He found something real, Margaret. Something dangerous. Margaret felt cold dread pooling in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "The compounds he developed. They don't change your body, but they change your brain. They create neural pathways that allow you to perceive things differently, to pick up on chemical and behavioral signals you normally couldn't process. He's been dosing himself for 7 years. His brain has physically changed. He can sense the lion's intentions, their emotions, their status in the pride hierarchy. Not because he's becoming a lion, but because he's rewired his human brain to process information the way their brains do." That's not possible." "Isn't it?" Sophia pulled out a scientific journal from her desk drawer, flagged to an article about neuroplasticity and cross-species cognition. "Human brains are incredibly adaptive. We can learn any language, adapt to any environment, process any kind of sensory information if we're exposed to it consistently enough. Daddy's compounds just accelerated that process, pushed it in directions no ethical researcher would ever attempt." Margaret looked at the article, seeing legitimate neuroscience twisted into service of Richard's obsession. Even if that's true, it doesn't justify what he did. He destroyed himself chasing a fantasy. But what if someone else gets the research? Sophia's eyes were intense now, urgent. Harrison knows something is wrong. The board of directors knows. Eventually, someone will search Daddy's office, find the compounds, find the formulas. What if they try to replicate it? What if they think they can control it better than he did? We'll destroy it. All of it. The compounds, the notes, everything. And the lions? Sophia's voice dropped to a whisper. What happens to them when the authorities find out Daddy's been conducting illegal experiments on himself while living with apex predators and a child? They'll seize them. Put them in sanctuaries, or worse, some zoo where they'll spend the rest of their lives in cages even smaller than what they have here. Margaret hadn't thought about that. Hadn't considered that the consequences of exposing Richard would extend to the innocent animals caught up in his delusion. Zahara saved Daddy today, Sophia continued. She didn't have to. She could have let Kasi and Tao kill him, it would have been natural, from a pride perspective. A weak member endangering the group should be eliminated. But she chose to protect him. Because somewhere in that magnificent brain, she understands that we're connected to them, that we're responsible for them. And if we betray that responsibility, if we let them be taken away and caged, what does that make us? Margaret sat down heavily on Sophia's bed, her mind reeling. The situation was far more complex than she'd realized. Not just a case of removing a child from a dangerous parent, but a tangled web of research, ethics, responsibility, and the fate of 3 lions who had no say in any of this. What do you want me to do? Margaret asked finally. Sophia came and sat beside her, taking her hand, a gesture of trust that nearly broke Margaret's heart. I want you to help me do what's right. Not what's easy, but what's right. For Daddy, for the lions, for everyone. And what is right? I don't know yet. Sophia's honesty was refreshing in a world where adults pretended to have all the answers. But I know we need to decide together. You and me. Because you're the first person who's ever stayed long enough to actually see what's really happening here. And I trust you, Margaret. I trust you to help me figure it out. As Margaret held the small hand in hers, she realized that Sophia Whitmore was far more remarkable than anyone gave her credit for. This wasn't a traumatized child passively accepting her circumstances. This was a brilliant young girl who'd been actively documenting evidence, protecting herself, and thinking strategically about consequences that most adults wouldn't consider. And now she was asking Margaret to be her partner in navigating an impossible situation, one where every choice seemed to involve betraying someone. They talked late into the night, Sophia sharing details Margaret hadn't known, filling in gaps in the story. How Richard's obsession had intensified after his father's death, how he'd sold off parts of the pharmaceutical company to fund his research, how he'd become increasingly isolated as his focus narrowed to transformation and the lions. He wasn't always like this, Sophia said quietly. I remember when I was little, before it got bad. He used to read to me, play games. He was a good daddy then. But after grandfather Robert died, something changed. It was like he inherited the obsession along with the company. Do you love him? Margaret asked gently. Even after everything? Sophia considered the question carefully. I love the daddy he used to be. I love the moments when he's present, when he's not lost in the transformation fantasy. But I'm also angry at him for choosing his delusion over me. For making me grow up in a house where I had to document evidence against my own father just to survive. Is it okay to love someone and be angry at them at the same time? Yes, Margaret said firmly. Yes, it's absolutely okay. And it's okay to want to protect him while also wanting to protect yourself. Those things can both be true. They fell silent, and outside, Margaret could hear the lions moving in their enclosures. Soft sounds, padded footsteps, the occasional low rumble of communication. Creatures living half wild, half captive, caught between worlds through no choice of their own. Just like Sophia, Margaret realized. Caught between childhood and premature adulthood, between loving her father and recognizing his danger, between the world she lived in and the world she deserved. Tomorrow, Margaret said. "We'll go see your father at the hospital. We'll assess how he is, what his mental state is like. Then we'll make decisions about next steps. Together. Does that work for you?" Sophia nodded, then surprised Margaret by hugging her. A real hug, the kind a child gives when they finally feel safe enough to be vulnerable. "Thank you for staying," Sophia whispered. "Thank you for not running away." As Margaret tucked Sophia into bed and turned off the lights, she stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the girl's small form under the covers. She'd come to this estate thinking it was a temporary job, a way to solve her financial problems. She'd stayed because she felt sorry for a lonely child. But now she understood it was more than that. She'd been given a responsibility, to help Sophia navigate the wreckage of her father's obsession and emerge whole on the other side. To ensure that the sins of the father and grandfather, and whoever came before them in this lineage of transformation seekers, didn't destroy the daughter too. It was a responsibility Margaret hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. As she walked back to her own room, she passed the ritual room. The door was open, and in the moonlight streaming through the windows, the drawings on the walls seemed to move, to breathe, the half-human, half-lion figures caught in their eternal transformation. Margaret closed the door firmly and continued down the hall. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new complications. But tonight, she'd made a promise to a brilliant, damaged child who deserved better than the hand she'd been dealt. And Margaret Chen, who'd come to this mansion desperate and broken, had discovered something unexpected in its strange, dangerous corridors, a purpose worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Even if it meant challenging everything she'd believed about right and wrong, about the boundaries between human and animal, about the responsibilities we owe to those who cannot speak for themselves, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Margaret stood outside the hospital room, watching through the small window as Sophia sat beside her father's bed. Richard Whitmore looked diminished, broken, his remaining arm handcuffed to the bed rail, a precaution the psychiatric team had insisted on, given his history and the circumstances of his injury. His eyes were hollow, medicated, the manic energy that had driven him into that enclosure completely drained away. 3 weeks had passed since the attack. 3 weeks of investigations, interviews, legal proceedings, and decisions that would reshape lives. Harrison had been surprisingly helpful once Margaret shared the evidence she'd gathered, recognizing that protecting Sophia had to take precedence over protecting his client's reputation. The board of directors, relieved to finally have grounds to remove Richard from leadership, had moved swiftly to appoint new management and distance the pharmaceutical company from the scandal. Child Protective Services had gotten involved, as Margaret knew they must. But something remarkable had happened during their investigation. Sophia herself, with the documentation she'd kept for years and the maturity she'd developed surviving her circumstances, had demonstrated such exceptional resilience and awareness that the caseworkers were convinced she didn't need to be removed from her environment, she needed her environment to be made safe. The solution they'd crafted together was imperfect but functional. Richard would receive the psychiatric treatment he needed, whether he wanted it or not. If he was eventually deemed stable enough to return home, it would be under strict supervision, with regular check-ins from both family services and medical professionals. The experimental compounds had been seized and destroyed, his research handed over to ethics boards to ensure nothing like it could happen again. And the lions. The lions would stay. Victor had been appointed as primary caretaker, with Margaret taking a permanent position not just as Sophia's nanny but as household manager, responsible for ensuring protocols were followed and safety maintained. A team of wildlife experts had conducted thorough evaluations, determining that Zahara, Kasi, and Tao could remain on the property under proper oversight, better than the alternatives of overcrowded sanctuaries or euthanasia. They didn't ask to be part of his delusion, Sophia had argued during the hearings. They deserve to live out their lives in the best environment we can provide. And I can ensure it's done right. I can be what Daddy couldn't, someone who loves them without needing them to be something they're not. Standing in that hospital corridor, Margaret marveled at Sophia's strength. The girl had been given a terrible childhood, surrounded by danger and delusion, forced to document evidence against her own father just to survive. But instead of being destroyed by it, she'd emerged with a clarity of purpose and moral certainty that most adults never achieved. Through the window, Margaret saw Sophia take Richard's hand gently. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the tears on both their faces, the complicated love between father and daughter persisting despite everything. Richard had made terrible choices, had endangered his child in pursuit of an impossible fantasy, but he'd also given Sophia something precious: a deep understanding of the natural world, a respect for creatures humans usually feared or dismissed, and a recognition that strength could come from unexpected places. Sophia would carry those gifts forward while leaving behind the poison of transformation obsession. She would grow up with lions in her backyard, yes, but as caretakers rather than as members of some imagined pride. She would learn to honor the boundary between human and animal, while still recognizing the connections that made that boundary permeable to empathy and understanding. It wasn't the future anyone would have chosen for a 7-year-old. But it was the future they had, and Sophia was determined to make something meaningful from it. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Victor. "Zahara's doing well. Still asking for Sophia. Ready when you are." They'd established a new routine over these 3 weeks. Every day, after Sophia completed her schoolwork, they would spend time with the lions, but differently now. No more pride time, with Zahara sprawled on living room rugs. The lions stayed in their outdoor enclosures, and interactions happened through observation, enrichment activities, and the kind of proper care that respected what they were rather than trying to make them into something else. Surprisingly, Zahara had adapted well to the change. As if she too understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the old rules no longer applied. She was still magnificent, still commanded attention with every movement, but she seemed more at peace in her properly maintained enclosure than she'd ever been in that strange existence half inside the house. Or maybe Margaret was just projecting, reading meaning into animal behavior the way Richard had done. The difference was that Margaret knew the limits of that interpretation, knew that she could never truly know what Zahara thought or felt, and respected that mystery rather than trying to solve it. The hospital room door opened, and Sophia emerged, her face composed despite the emotional weight of the visit. She took Margaret's hand naturally, the way she did now, no longer the isolated child who expected everyone to leave, but someone learning to trust that stability could exist. "He's getting better," Sophia reported as they walked toward the elevator. "The doctors say the medications are helping. He even admitted today that the transformation was impossible, that he was chasing something that could never exist." How did that feel to hear? Sad. Sophia pressed the elevator button. Because it means he wasted so much time, hurt himself so badly, for nothing. But also, relieved? Like maybe now he can start healing for real, instead of just trying to become something else to escape the pain. The wisdom in those words from a 7-year-old mouth made Margaret's throat tight. "You know you're pretty remarkable, right? Most kids your age wouldn't be able to articulate feelings that complex. Most kids my age didn't grow up the way I did." Sophia smiled slightly. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe all the weird, scary stuff taught me things I wouldn't have learned otherwise. I don't want to live through it again, but I also don't want to pretend it didn't happen. It made me who I am." They drove home in comfortable silence, the autumn landscape rolling past the windows. The estate appeared in the distance, less imposing now that Margaret knew its secrets, understood the broken man who'd built it, recognized it not as some monument to wealth but as a desperate attempt to create meaning in a life that had felt meaningless. That evening, Margaret and Sophia stood at the enclosure fence, watching Zahara groom herself in the fading sunlight. The lioness looked up, her amber eyes finding theirs, and for a moment, there was recognition, not of Pride members, not of transformation partners, but simply of the humans who cared for her, who ensured her needs were met, who respected her nature. "Do you think she misses it?" Sophia asked. "Being inside, being part of the house?" "I think she's where she belongs now," Margaret answered. "And I think she knows you still care about her, even if the relationship looks different." Sophia nodded, accepting that truth. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" "Always. When this is all over, when Daddy's better, when everything's stable, will you stay? Not because I need you for safety, but because I want you to." Margaret looked at this extraordinary child, this survivor who'd documented evidence against her own father while still loving him, who'd fought to protect lions while also protecting herself, who'd emerged from trauma with empathy intact rather than hardened by cynicism. "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "I'll stay. Not just for you, but for this." She gestured at the enclosures, at the strange household they'd created from the wreckage of Richard's delusion. "Because I think we're building something important here. Not transformation or transcendence, but something simpler and more valuable, a place where humans and wild animals coexist with mutual respect, where boundaries are honored even as connections are maintained. A place where you don't have to become something else to be enough," Sophia added. "Exactly." As the sun set and the lions settled in for the night, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd come desperate, broken by medical bills and her mother's illness. Her mother, who was now in remission, whose treatments had been covered by Margaret's generous salary from this strange job. She'd stayed because a lonely child needed someone to not run away. But she'd found something she hadn't expected, a purpose that transcended simple caregiving. A recognition that the relationship between humans and nature, between civilization and wilderness, between what we are and what we imagine we could be, required not transformation but integration. Not transcendence but acceptance. Richard Whitmore had spent years trying to become a lion because he couldn't bear being human. But the truth he'd missed was simpler and more profound. Being human meant having the capacity to care for creatures different from ourselves, to recognize their intrinsic worth, to serve as guardians rather than as gods or peers. It meant accepting limitation, acknowledging that there were experiences and perspectives we could never fully access, and respecting those boundaries even as we sought connection across them. It meant being enough, exactly as we were, while still striving to be better versions of ourselves. These were the lessons Margaret had learned in the Whitmore estate's strange halls, lessons she would help Sophia carry forward as the girl grew into the remarkable woman she was already becoming. You've stayed with this story until the end, which means you're exactly the kind of person who understands that truth is rarely simple, that the most profound revelations often come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the wildest creatures teach us the most about being human. You've witnessed Margaret's journey from desperate employee to guardian of a damaged child and 3 magnificent lions. You've seen Richard Whitmore's descent into delusion and the terrible cost of trying to transcend human nature rather than accepting it. You've watched Sophia emerge from trauma with wisdom and strength that defied her years. But more than that, you've engaged with questions that most people never consider. What are we willing to sacrifice in pursuit of transformation? How do we balance love and responsibility when they seem to conflict? What obligations do we owe to creatures who cannot speak for themselves? And how do we find meaning in existence without needing to become something other than what we are? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. But they're worth asking, worth wrestling with, worth carrying forward into your own life and experiences. So here's what I ask of you now. In the comments, write, "This story changed the way I see the relationship between humans and nature." Because by doing so, you acknowledge that you've truly understood what this narrative was about. Not lions in a mansion, not a man's descent into madness, but the fundamental question of how we relate to wildness both outside and within ourselves. You're now part of a community of people who refuse to accept surface-level explanations, who dig deeper, who recognize that the most important truths are often hidden in stories that seem strange or impossible on first examination. Share this video with others who are ready to question their assumptions about human nature, animal consciousness, and the boundaries we create between ourselves and the natural world. Help build this community of truth seekers, people who understand that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that challenge you, that make you think, that refuse to provide easy answers to complex questions. Because this is what we do here. We explore the shadows where conventional wisdom fears to tread. We examine the spaces between certainty and mystery. We honor the complexity of existence rather than reducing it to comfortable platitudes. And finally, watch the other videos on this channel. Each one offers a different doorway into the inexplicable, the profound, the truths that most people spend their lives avoiding. Keep your curiosity alive. Keep questioning. Keep seeking understanding even when, especially when, the answers are uncomfortable. Thank you for trusting me to guide you through Margaret's journey, through the Whitmore estate's strange corridors, through the question of what it means to be human in a world full of creatures who live by different rules. Thank you for staying when others would have turned away. Thank you for being brave enough to confront difficult truths. You are the reason these stories matter. You are the community that makes this work meaningful. You are the ones who dare to look at reality unflinchingly and still find beauty and meaning in what you see. Until next time, remember, transformation isn't about becoming something else. It's about becoming more fully what you already are, accepting both the limitations and the possibilities of human existence, and finding the courage to care for others, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4, with wisdom, compassion, and respect. The truth is waiting for those brave enough to seek it. And you've proven that you are.